Hey guys, this is Matt Gurney, and this is the latest episode of On the Line, the Line's long form interview podcast. Excited to have as my guest today Richard Shimooka. He is a writer. I have published him before as an editor. He used to write for me at the National Post. He's also, right now, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he is one of those very precious and rare weirdos. And I say that with love and affection. He's a Canadian defense and military expert, and there aren't that many of those. What are we talking about today? Geopolitics. What's happening to the United States? What do we expect to see from the Americans next? And what Canada should be doing to get ready for all of these things? All that and more in my conversation with Richard Shimooka. This is On the Line. This message is brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. Canadian forestry supports 200,000 workers, generates $87 billion in annual revenue, and provides the products we need to build homes and drive economic growth. While trade barriers from the U.S. threaten jobs and investment, Canada's own approval processes and regulations are blocking critical projects that increase our self-reliance. We can and should have programs that expand domestic wood use, advance biomass and pulp market opportunities, and cut red tape and regulatory barriers. The Government of Canada has a clear opportunity to stand up for Canadian forestry at a time of growing global uncertainty. We need real action that puts Canadians first, supporting employees and their families, securing stability for our businesses, and protecting the long-term potential of our sector and its people. To learn more, visit forestryforthefuture.ca. All right, so we can have some fun with this one today, Richard, because before we even started rolling here, you and I were having a laugh because you and I have been talking about this stuff for years. You've written articles for me back when I was at the Post. You are a regular contributor to newspapers. You write for The Hub. You talk about these defense issues here. And you and I were just having a bit of a laugh before we got started here, which was like, guess what, everybody? Turns out we weren't weirdos. Like all of the stuff we've been writing about for years is kind of happening here in the realm of geopolitics and defense. We're going to talk mostly today about Canadian defense and Canadian defense issues, but I want to throw just a big picture question at you here. And I think you and I are pretty much on the same page on this one. What do you think is happening globally in terms of the geopolitics here? Like something that Jen and I have been writing about is that there's probably been an identifiable historical era, the post-Second World Era, and I think it's over. And I think we're rolling into something new now. And I don't know when the future historians are going to say that happened. Maybe it was 2016, maybe it was 2020, maybe it was November 6th, 2024. I honestly don't know. Well, what is your sense of just the overall trajectory of things? As you and I were talking before we rolled here about the United States and kind of what they are focused on here. If you know your 20th century history, it's really confusing. If you know your 19th century history, it actually all sounds kind of familiar.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Good to have you.
It's a it's a tough one because there's so many different ways, and I think that if we just think about how our societies have just become so much more multifaceted. It's not, we're not all just farmers and a couple of people, that are some educated people like we were at the beginning of the 20th century. We have far more interests. We have far more sort of the nature of our economies are far more dispersed and divergent in ways. And the way, if we think about it from a media lens, the way that we consume or understand our world is so much more bifurcated, or not bifurcated. It's been broken up into various little fiefdoms of information, and how you understand that is, depends on how you're educated, where you come from. And so in some ways, this period of this atomization of our knowledge and understanding, not just in one country, but in many different countries, is really sort of taken hold. So just watching what's happened over the past week here, what you do with Ukraine, right? And how a subset of people within the United States with fairly far right views, who to some, in many cases, have been sort of lived within this misinformation machine that has some basis from Kremlin propaganda. right? Or other parts. And it's kind of morphed and continually moved forward. I feel that that's part of it, right? So I know that's a very sort of focused view, but I think that we, how everybody's understanding this world today is far more varied than it was, let's say, 1990, right? Right at the end of the Cold War. We had clear defining narratives, and everybody's trying to fight to define a narrative or to push through the narrative. And it's such a slog because it's so varied and it's so difficult to sort of say, look, you know, Ukraine needs our help. We need to defend this liberal order, which some of you may not have felt like you were doing very well in. But
Yeah.
the reality, the alternative. If you actually see this alternative, it's a lot worse. And I think to some degree, I think the United people within the United States, many who voted for Trump, are starting to see the scary part of this. Is like, well, what happens if you don't have a Department of Education, or something like that, right? And so
Yeah.
the alternatives there, I think, has really sort of we've become so cynical in some ways, and everybody started tearing things down, and there's no real objective truth, or there's no kind of clear truths that has made it really difficult, that has allowed sort of a lot of the information to go out there and sort of really undermine what we understand as being what we used to understand. You and I, we were educated and understand to how foreign policy and international relations work, and that's just misinformation's kind of replaced a large portion of that.
It's fascinating because I think you and I are around the same age. And don't worry, folks, we'll get to the military stuff in a minute. But when we're talking about the information universe, I still have like vivid muscle memory. Like I can see it, I can feel it, I can hear it of how I used to turn on the first TV we had in the house. You had to pull the knob out, and it was also the volume knob. And when you wanted to change the channel, you took the wheel and you went clunk, 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 clunk. And there was only like 11 options on it. And my parents used to tell me that 11 was a lot because there'd been 3 or 4 when they'd been growing up. And we have gone from an information universe where you and I sort of formed, where our information universe was 11 TV channels, because that's how many times you could turn the wheel on the TV, plus a few radio stations. For me, I grew up in Toronto, so, listen to Q107, classic rock, but also maybe the news channel occasionally. And then you'd get a morning newspaper thrown on your doorstep. That was the information universe. Now I carry this thing around with me, and it's unlimited information being pumped into my brain at the speed of light. And I can guarantee you it's changed me, and I'm pretty well educated. Like, I think I have pretty good information hygiene overall. And I mentioned the history of it all a minute ago, and you were talking about the cost, the hidden cost. I think one of the things the Americans are going to discover is that the costs of being the global hegemon were visible to them. Some of the benefits weren't. And so look, like I have friends who are Iraq and Afghan veterans, and they're like, I don't want my kids having to go through what I do. And I get it. And then, also there's just the fiscal argument of the size of the American defense budget. I don't know how to explain to the American people that not all of their life, but some of their life is the product, the beneficiary of a US led global democratic order that the Americans seem to have lost interest in. And look, I mentioned before the 19th century. We're talking about Canadian annexation. We're talking about the Panama Canal. We're talking about Western Hemisphere defense. There's a familiar ring to a lot of this stuff. This is just what happens when the American people, in their wisdom, decide they don't really care that much about Asia. They don't care that much about Europe. Maybe the US Navy will still try to enforce some freedom of the seas because that's good for US business. But I think they're done. And in a column I wrote recently, I said, America shrugged. This is like imperial fatigue. And they're going to make some savings on the costs, but I think they're going to pay prices they haven't even thought about yet.
Well, I think it's important to understand, I guess, what we think about national interest, right? There's innumerable sort of international relations theories that talk about the state as a unitary actor and all that, and I won't bore your listeners on it by any means. But certainly, I think there is a what's called the foreign policy blob, and I think there is a broader consensus within the U.S. In national security establishment, not the government, not the people at the top, not the president, the current president, but certainly among the among Congress, its staff there, within Department of Defense, within the think tank community, that understood intrinsically just how much the American people actually benefited from this system. The free trade that allows grain from Iowa to or soybeans from Iowa to go to China or wherever, and how much that really benefited and propped up our prices. All this kind of stuff, right? Existed. And what I think is what we think we have to understand a bit about the Trump administration is that the people Donald Trump himself is not a foreign policy expert by any stretch of imagination. I think he has a theory of how he thinks he has to act and a view not super well developed, let's say, on how he wants the international community or how he wants the United States to play within this international environment. I think he has a view of that, but it doesn't easily conform to the actual reality. And I think he's got a staff around him who are not what we would call the A bench of American foreign policy and defense policy experts. I think there's a lot of people there who are really, frankly, superficially sort of understanding of what's going on, and that's why you see actually, that's where you're starting to see somewhat of a clash among the American government,
Mhm.
among some of the heavy duty national security experts, the people who have operated and understand how important defense relations are. They're starting to say, no, this is not this is going to cause real damage to us. And like, especially within Congress, like you see GOP senators quietly say, I'm not too sure if this is what we want to do, especially in the light of some of these budget cuts that are coming forward.
You know what? It's pretty wild to me in recent days. And we were talking a minute ago about the information universe and my TV with knobs and the radio with the dial that I could learn to spin. And every once in a while, I'd get the volume dial confused with the band dial, and I would really crank that thing, and I'd get in trouble.
Yep.
But we live in an era, of course, where each and every one of us can go out and create a social media platform and just start issuing statements. And it's wild to me to basically be like, put on the news, and here is live from the Oval Office, and then look at my phone, and some like retired four-star general with 50 years of military and foreign policy experience is tweeting in real time, going, "What the fuck is happening in the Oval Office?" Like,
100%.
it's wild. All right. I want to move on to Canadian military stuff, but I got one more question for you here just to kind of set this up, and then we'll take a quick break. But the question for you is, what do you think? And like, I'm gonna, you know what? Let me actually lay out a theory for you, and then you can tell me if you think I'm basically right here. What I think is going to happen is that the Americans, for better or worse, are going to disentangle themselves as much as they can from Europe and the Pacific. Probably less in the Pacific because they are worried about China, but they have clearly decided they don't want to be Russia's enemy. You know, they'll contest them where it makes sense, but they don't want to be locked in. They don't want to be bogged down in the Middle East either. Although Israel has a domestic political constituency in the United States, so that's going to be a complicated one. But that the Americans basically want to pull back to what I've been calling kind of Fortress North America, or a North American defense perimeter, which seems to go from the North Pole to about the Panama Canal. That, and then probably Hawaii to maybe the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That's all they really seem to care about. And I know that there will continue to be an American strategic military presence because they can bomb the crap out of anyone or they can nuke anyone. And they're probably going to be worried about the sea lanes. But other than that, I don't think the Americans want to care anymore. And I think the message they're sending, that our European allies in particular have maybe only really accepted in the last 48 hours, is Europe's business. And the best case scenario for Europe might be a phased American withdrawal that gives the Europeans a chance to build up. The worst case scenario for Europe is that Donald Trump issues an order saying in 90 days, I want everything shut down, and just everybody comes home.
Yeah. But yes, that's it. We're done. I honestly, I think that is a high likelihood. I think that was telegraphed in his first term. I think in his second term, we've seen much more of a willingness to actually just go and do it,
Do it.
and sort of damn the torpedoes, damn the consequences, right? And again, the damage to the prestige that the American foreign policy conduct has built up since Truman, right? And then through George H.W. Bush, and even after, I think is going to be immense. I think we had a little bit of a replay of it if you thought about George W. Bush and the Iraq War and how that. But I mean,
Yeah.
to some degree, stylistically, it looked bad, but in substance, it didn't really, I mean, you can think about Donald Rumsfeld thinking, oh, we're just going to go to the Eastern European allies and
Yeah.
get their support, and who cares about France?
We're going to bypass
Uh,
old Europe, is what he
Old
said.
Europe versus New Europe, that
Yeah.
construct for sure. But now it's like, no, we're just out of Europe, right? And in the irony is that there's a lot of governments that look to the U.S. as a savior. I think about Poland. I think about
Mhm.
the Baltics, Czechia, or any country like that. Look to U.S. as being like, this is our, you know, politically, we find inspiration in that, and even they're getting left out in the cold in a way. And so uh, that is a shock. But I think to some degree, Europe, as we and two colleagues and I are going to arguing the Globe in a couple of days, they said that this is the first time since 1941 that Europe has agency. Like these
Yeah.
European countries, like the United Kingdom, France, obviously Germany was on their side at the time, but after 1940, they have real agency in their security affairs, and they need to take a hold of it and
Yeah.
do something with it using really untested or non-existent political institutions. Like to recall that Kissinger line saying, who do I call in Europe? Well, somebody's got to figure out now,
Yeah.
right? You actually need to have a position, and you got to fund it and implement it. And they have very similar underlying problems of the political discourse as we do, right?
Mm.
Where you have the potential for far right or even far left governments to come in or have a slice of the political pie. Like the AfD in Germany didn't do terrible. And so you have to figure out a position across, 20, almost 30 states, right? And try to do it's a really difficult political moment.
Yeah, I think you're bang on that one, and for the Europeans in particular, like, I find myself, to an extent I'm not used to, offering prayers of thanks to the French nuclear deterrent and the Polish army, 'cause
Oh yeah.
they've got the sinews of a continental security apparatus there. They're not starting from nothing,
Yeah, what's
but
interesting, I know you got, but I would say the one thing I find interesting is how Asian states are responding to this.
Mhm.
I look at how Japan, less than South Korea, but they have their own political problems. By Ishiba has like there's alarm, but it's not. They aren't. Maybe they don't have to face the same crisis, but
Yeah.
there's a bit more stability there, and I think that that's an interesting thing is how to maybe deal with Trump. Is that they are much more stable. They are much more confident in some ways, and they've been able thus far. We're only a month into this, but like they've certainly kind of they seem to be a little bit better at writing it out, and I find that's interesting. But that was kind of similar in the first term for Trump. I mean, you think about how Shinzo Abe, was able to develop that relationship, and I didn't see that much that was different when when Japanese Prime Minister met Trump. So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of contrast.
Yeah, I mean, my sense on that, we'll move on after this, is I think the Americans know they have to pull out of Asia differently and more slowly, and the Asian allies know that they can work with that. And if necessary, I bet you South Korea and Japan could probably go nuclear before the Americans could actually pull out entirely. Europe, I don't think so. It can be a 90-day withdrawal order. The Americans would probably want to keep the Fifth Fleet at Naples and maybe Landstuhl in Germany, but other than that, they can be gone.
Yeah, but I mean, that's something that's been forward, and
Or is
again,
it
like
Sixth Fleet at Naples? I think it's
I
Sixth Fleet, but whatever. They might want to keep a base or two, but other than
it's
that,
I mean, the other thing is that if you think about Middle East, how important Germany has been with Ramstein and
yeah.
their like just a trend. So I mean, they may, but again, uh, think about how Doge has gone down. Think
Mhm.
about like just how things have been kind of breaking. Yeah, exactly, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's like the federal workforce. Think about how the, the development of the American foreign policy footprint across the globally, right? Understanding that and how easily they're willing to break stuff like Medicare or Social Security domestically, that actually has real political
Mhm.
consequences for the Republican Party, which I think some of their people are now seeing it as like, well, maybe
Yeah.
we'll slow down on this. But I think they're willing to do that globally because I don't think many of them have the understanding appreciation or willing to break that because they see this somewhat as like, well, they believe it hasn't brought them the prosperities that they think it has, even though it really has.
Mhm.
They're willing to break that, and I think that that's the scary bit.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back in a moment, we're going to talk about how this all relates to Canada. Stay tuned. On the line, we'll continue. This message is brought to you by the Meteis Nation of Ontario. It's St. Joseph Island, 1879, a winter like no other. The snow is deep, the winds howl, and the people are hungry. Supplies have run out, and shopkeepers in Sault Ste. Marie and Bruce mines have sent to Collingwood for critical food supplies. The distance is more than 600 kilometers. The roads are buried, and the storm relentless. The settlers of St. Joseph Island wait, their only hope riding on the endurance of teams of Métis mail carriers such as Louis Miron and Michel Labatte with their dog sleds. Day after day, the Métis push forward across vast distances. Their sleds are packed with supplies. Through freezing winds and blinding blizzards, they do what others cannot and keep entire communities from starving that winter. Through skill and sacrifice, Métis mail carriers kept people alive so the upper Great Lakes in what is now Ontario could grow and thrive. Their legacy endures, carried on the winter winds. To learn more, go to OntarioMétisFacts.com. Well, we're back. My guest, Richard, and I have set out for you what we agree is going to be the scope of American withdrawal. And I think, Richard, that leaves my Canadian audience in particular with kind of three questions, and we'll tackle them in sequence. What kind of a military we have, what kind of a military we should have, and how do we go get it? So let's actually talk about it now. You know, you and I have talked about this a little bit, and I want to front load this comment here. I have nothing but good things to say about the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces. That they are miracle workers. They do incredible work under incredible conditions with very little support. But I think it's just worth opening up here with the observation. We don't have enough of them. And I just don't mean we should have a bigger military. I mean, we don't even have as many soldiers as we're supposed to have because both the regular forces and the reserve are pretty badly understaffed here. Then we get into issues of deferred training, equipment serviceability here. We have an Army, we have a Navy, and we have an Air Force. None of them right now are actually capable of delivering all the missions that they're supposed to be able to. Every day they make do as best they can, which is why I love the men and the women. But I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine recently. You tell me if you think I'm nuts about this. We have an Army and a Navy and an Air Force that is capable on a fairly regular basis of meeting the low end of its obligations. So if the Russians send a bomber into the NORAD ID zone, we can send a CF-18. When it's time for a Canadian ship to sail as part of a multilateral group, we can do that. We are attempting to sustain a brigade in Europe, and it's proving hard, but for now, we're able to do it. And we also have the ability domestically to handle routine operations, more or less. So search and rescue, sandbags during a flood, fighting forest fires. What I don't think the broader public understands is that if anything goes wrong, we're already at the top of our capabilities. And if we suddenly needed to send 1,000 soldiers to a UN peacekeeping mission in Africa, we couldn't.
No,
If we needed to send a squadron of fighter jets to participate in some coalition response, we don't have them.
and they wouldn't want
And
them.
yeah, probably wouldn't. And if there was an emergency, like some piracy, I know this is unlikely, but just hypothetically, if a bunch of pirates were rampaging through the Caribbean and the Americans said, "Help us put a task force together," we got no ships.
Very close.
Yeah.
It depends. It depends on where we are in our deployment cycle. So I guess the ways I think probably the best way to understand this is that we have a military that is showing 20 some, or if not 30 years of delayed modernization efforts.
Yeah.
There's not been a political objective except for a small time between around, let's say, 2005, 2006 to around 2011 was the only time. And that was the Afghanistan years under Harper. And at that time, the modernization and the bulk of the funding went towards what we would call counterinsurgency operations and those sort of contingencies. So in reality, the Army and to a lesser extent, the Air Force got funding that would support that mission. So that's the C-130Js, the C-17s, a lot of labs. But
Mine resistant vehicles, things like that. Yeah.
we don't even have. I mean, these are for gone and the Chinooks, and then before and after that, no funding. And the only thing that's kind of been going on is the Navy has started getting new ships,
Mhm.
which are starting to come. Like, I mean, the AOPs are actually a decent story. I mean, there have
Yep.
been some issues, but I mean, those are
The normal
not.
teething issues of any major
If
ship.
you look
Yeah.
at any other sort of, I can point to you the newest carrier class, the Jared Ford class, had the lead in the pipes, the sewer system that were anyways, these are normal things. So there's that. They have the big thing is the river class destroyers, which are delayed. They cost a lot, but I think if you look everywhere else, you look at how the Americans are having problems right now with their Constellation class frigate, same issues.
Mhm.
It's just everywhere these. But anyways, let's not here there. The overall though, you see everywhere the lack of attention, lack of political priority for this mission. And as a result, what's happening is you've seen rundown capabilities. CF-18s are going to hit 50 years in about 5 years' time, right? Of age. They're done. Like
Yeah.
they are not a. They can do what other European countries would call air policing,
Yep.
i.e., defense of your territory. That's about it, right? They don't constitute a modern cutting edge force as we see other countries as they buy the F-35 or they start investing in their existing fourth plus generation platforms. So we think about the Rafale, the Eurofighter, and they're bridging that, and they have their next generation, the sixth generation, like the Tempest and the NGF and or the FCAS, which is between Germany and France. To see those, so these taking this serious, they've done that. There is issues. They don't have enough people, but they're starting to build that. Whereas in Canada, we just kind of run down to the nub. So we have a lot of these little capability sets because that's all that's left. Or we only bought enough to just fill the ability to show that we're doing something. The best example is tanks. We bought 100 some tanks that really allowed the Canadian Force to only deploy 20 tanks at one time, and that's it because that's what they perceived at the time is that the minimum we can get away with in order to have a deployable formation in a place like Afghanistan or wherever and show the flag and that's it. And we see that with Latvia. So we're able to sustain just that, but we have no what's called an attritional reserve.
Mhm.
So if it ever got violent, if there ever, we have literally enough tanks, helicopters, or whatever for, a couple days of
Days.
combat and we're done, right?
Yep.
And it's even, you can see it in munitions. Like, this is why we had so little to give the Ukrainians. Because the way under successive cutbacks or, skinnying down of the defense budget, it's like, well, we can always go and just buy that munitions from the Americans. So we'll only buy, let's say, 18 guided bombs or whatever, and use those for training. We have the capability, and then if we ever need to, we can go somewhere abroad and buy it. And as we see what's going on in Ukraine has made clear, is like, no, you can't. Doesn't exist. Like those, if you don't produce it, or if you don't have like a guaranteed supply chain to do so, it doesn't exist. So that's the whole other side of the problem is that we never really conceived of what is actually required to be in a fight or be in a sort of a real sort of difficult situation. We've only built enough to sort of maintain a perspective or maintain a facade of a defense contribution with our allies. And for years, literal, if not decades, our allies have said, no, this is not acceptable. When the Wales summit in 2014 happened with NATO, where they said when 2% was brought in, Canada at that time was seen as one of the laggards. It was clear, and there was private discussions to say, look, you're one of the laggards here. You need to spend on this. And we never did. We actively resisted it until the very last moment at the Washington summit last year, where finally, the Trudeau government said, okay, yeah, we'll meet this 2%. But it took literal decade to get to that point. And here we are. And the outcome, the actual output of defense is really just not, it's just not there.
I don't want to make this a partisan issue because the failures for this, you said before, we're at the 20 or 30 years of this, and that's liberals, that's conservatives, that's a variety of prime ministers. But I want to illustrate the point, and I don't say this to pick on him. I was tweeting just a few days ago because I went back and I found the article. It was 22 months ago where that weirdo Air National Guard guy leaked a bunch of U.S. documents onto the dark web.
Back to Syria.
Yeah, and one of them was an American defense assessment based on a NATO meeting, which was that the Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, showed up at the meeting and says, "Yeah, I know we said we're going to hit 2%, but we're not." And he said there's just no political appetite in Canada. There's no political constituency, and it's not realistic politically for me to hit that. So we're going to continue to say we will in public, but I'm telling you behind closed doors, we're not going to actually do that. And I just think it's really interesting now. And I'm not, again, I don't want to make this particularly about Justin Trudeau, because I don't think Prime Minister O'Toole or Poilievre would have spent a ton more on defense at least 2 years ago. But
Well, let me just put a point. I can show you how it's maybe not as partisan. The debate between having enough for war fighting versus just having enough to be administratively efficient, that's a debate that's happened since the 60s in the Glasgow Commission. That we did unification in order to save money, even though it was clear at the time that this would have real repercussions for our ability to fight a war with the Soviet Union. And so there has been this impulse through however many governments that's occurred since, except for maybe Mulroney. And then when he had his plan, the Cold War ended and the plan went away, right? So ever since, there's been this effort to sort of say, well, how can we get the most efficient armed forces? And the reality is, because I know you have a degree in this area, is that war is not efficient. There's no efficient way to win. The way that there is, by the reality is that you want to overmatch. And what does overmatch means? It means that you have more resources, more capability, more technology at your sort of fingertips to win, right? And
yeah,
that wasn't the impulse we were going on. We were trying to say, how can we cheap out on this? And so this is a long, long history of Canada.
Yeah, to break this into terms for the non-weirdos.
Sorry.
No, but I think this is important, right? Overmatch is where you destroy the enemy in as cost-free a way as possible for you by simply overwhelming them. So if the enemy has 10,000 well-armed, well-trained guys, you don't send 11,000 well-trained, well-armed guys. You send 50,000. And every one of those poor son of bitch enemies guys has 5 of your guys shooting at them, and they die very quickly. And most of your 50,000 get to go home and become voters. Sorry, go ahead. No, and I was going to say, and of course, what we've been doing for decades has been, how few guys can we get away sending on the NATO patrol so that, first of all, we don't get yelled at the next NATO conference, but also that the Prime Minister gets to go out and talk about our enduring commitment to NATO. Don't you know we have a frigate with the task force right now? And don't you know we have troops in Latvia right now? The military has been optimized to serve foreign policy and political functions of looking like we have a military. It has not been optimized to fight and win battles.
The way the West has fought as well, so it's easier, 10,000 or whatever. Versus
we've just done it with explosives.
Well, what? The core part of this is like, we've won through a technology-heavy force, and that's expensive.
Yeah, you've got 10,000 guys, but we've got 4 B-52s.
Exactly, yeah. Right? Like we can just wipe out, but that's costly, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a real, and I know we're going to get to this in the future, but just we've not kept up with some of the really cutting edge developments that are happening in the U.S. among allies like Australia or the United Kingdom, who have identified ways to be faster, more effective, through use of network systems, drawing in sort of these new revolutionary developments that we see in AI or in drone warfare and stuff like that, right? Canadian forces aren't even at that part yet. We are not just a decade behind, we're coming up to 2 decades behind some of these developments. We don't have, like, if we look at our Latvia force, for example, one of the big things that everybody started to invest in based on what's gone on in Ukraine is highly mobile, highly accurate artillery systems. Mm-hmm. Ones that can shoot a bunch of shells or a bunch of rounds in, under a minute or so quickly, and it's quickly move away so that there's no counter battery, they can't be destroyed, and just keep going, right?
Yep.
What doesn't even have a system? We're not even there. Like, and if you looked at R&R Stronger and Free, the last white paper that was promulgated, it kicked the can on all those capabilities. It only focused on North American capabilities and gave money for that. But the stuff that to deal with the sort of war fighting that's, we would maybe have to base in Eastern Europe, never actually came through. It actually was just not funded. And so we still are doing it. I mean, even at this time, even this like era of real urgency, like it was clear that there was a possibility that Donald Trump could have won in the spring, right? That
Mhm.
was, and yet even there, they're like, well, we're just not going to worry about that problem, like we're just
What could go wrong?
exactly right. And so here we are. So this is really even decisions made less than a year ago, 9 months ago, failed to address some of these issues. We are only now starting to address the munitions supply chain,
Mhm.
artillery shells and whatnot. Department of Defense, in some cases, spent before we did
Mhm.
on shoring up our own munition supply chain because they were like, "Well, we can benefit from this. If you're not going to do it, then
Oh, yeah. The
we
Americans were buying ammo from Canadian producers to get the Canadian
exactly,
producers running again.
exactly." And
Yeah.
that's you take the military out of it. There was a huge business case for this, but we failed to do so. And you had a deputy minister in Canada say, "Well,
We're looking at it.
well, no, they basically said private industry has to invest more." It's like that's not how this works.
Yeah,
Private
I know.
industry, you're not gonna outsource your entire military to private industry. You have to spend for it.
You mentioned artillery systems a minute ago, and on the ammunition front, I was told through someone who would know that there was before the federal cabinet 2 years ago a plan for a relatively small infusion of public dollars on the scale of federal spending. It's a few $100 million, but it wasn't a huge amount of money, and it was to go to producing assembly lines, the actual raw plant equipment, plus training the operators who would do that. And then that sat at the federal cabinet for about 2 years before someone finally got around to signing off on it. And it wasn't that the cabinet thought it was controversial or they didn't want to do it. It just wasn't a priority. So it just sat there. And every cabinet meeting they would have, they would only have time for so many items. And the build more ammo in Canada file never made it up to the surface. The other thing you mentioned, though, talking about artillery, before it got eaten up by a GTA real estate venture, because they built a subdivision on this, I used to belong to a skeet shooting club, and I have a really nicely balanced double barrel shotgun that I haven't been able to use properly in years for skeet shooting. This basically means I have more anti-drone capabilities than the Canadian Armed Forces.
I was gonna say, I mean, you talked about that. We had 3 urgent operational requests to do with, deployment to Latvia. Uh, some of them got filled. That there are aspects of it that they have gotten some surface-to-air missiles and other areas, but if if you look at what's gone on in the United States or even in Europe, the scare factor that these systems have provided them, what they're seeing in Ukraine, there's basically been for the last decade a crash program to
Mhm.
develop every manner of anti-drone system, and we're not even started. We Parts of the program have been re-rolled or restarted. We bought parts of it, but I mean, it's still delayed. Put it this way: the U.S. Army has basically developed, built, and then put into service a whole generation of new air defense systems like MSHORAD and stuff like that. In the space of time that we went and based, I mean, there's some aspects to it that we did buy some, but we didn't even we went did a study and all that, and then canceled the program and it restarted again, and it just reflects the lack of alacrity, I guess would be the word
Uh,
for this. This is an urgent operational request. So when I hear, like a Christian Freeland go and say, "Oh, we're going to make this all UORs as they're called," it's like, yeah, but this process hasn't worked.
we
Like it's
still
not
cancel the urgent request and then reboot the program.
exactly. I mean, the air defense is a bit of a weird one, but I mean, it's the tank systems, it's all these areas, like, and there's so many, like across the board. We need more systems we need more systems with more munitions. Like the big change, if you think about it, is that we don't need systems in the sense that the big heavy tank platforms, a lot of this stuff is becoming, as I call it, consumables.
Mhm.
Is that if you think about the Switchblade drones we just bought, right? That have been announced for Latvia. Or if you think about RPAS, which is the new medium altitude large drone that we bought a couple years ago, and sort of it's going to come in service in a couple years. If we again watch what happened to Ukraine when they bought a similar system, the Backyard TB2, those systems don't last very long.
They were
They
gone
last
in weeks.
They were gone in weeks.
Yeah.
And so the way that warfare is starting to happen is everything should be seen as a consumable. It's like you need a process to identify the system, put into service, use it, iterate a newer, better model, some improvement, and then send it out again. And you see this constant struggle to fight our enemies, or Ukraine to fight its enemy, Russia, in order to deal with it. And in Canada, that's not even a thing yet. It's not even started because we still think in this old model of what's going on, how we bought things in the 80s and 90s is still being employed today. And so that even that first step of it's in some ways, it's not so much buying the system, it's building the process to continually buy the system in a warfighting. And we're just not even on that point.
Well, I mean, who has that kind of time? So see, we laugh because we don't want to cry in the middle of the podcast. It's not good listening. So let's talk a little bit. I think the conversation has sort of organically moved a little bit there, but let's talk about what kind of a military Canada should have. And it's amazing to me when I talk with people, even at very high levels of government or even the armed forces. Look, the armed forces guys get it. Like, they're some of the most clear-eyed people I've ever had the opportunity to speak to. But then you talk to the politicians and you're like, okay, well, what kind of military do we want? And they look at you and they're like, what? Like, there is a complete absence of strategic thinking in Canadian politics. And with very few exceptions, and one or two of them are liberal and maybe three or four of them are conservatives, it's incredible to me that you will say to these guys, like, okay, like, conservatives, you look likely to win the next election. What are you going to do with the military? And they're like, well, we're going to spend 20% more. And like, that's the way they think about this, right? Because they view it as a political problem. Liberals don't do enough. Therefore, we will do enough by doing more. And then I say to them, okay, but like, what kind of ships do we need? What kind of submarines do we need? What kind of air defenses do you want? How many brigades do you want to be able to deploy? What do you want the capabilities to be? And they look at me like I just started speaking to them in Klingon. They don't understand the words. And it comes down to weirdos again, like you and I say that with love and affection, but we're the ones having the conversation about, like, in 2035, what should the Canadian Armed Forces be capable of doing, especially if the Americans have decided to take their ball and go home.
Yeah. Well, let me plug your rival institute or rival, Save Us on the Line podcast. I mean, one of my favorite articles I've ever written at the Hub was about.
Hey, we love the Hub. We don't mind plugging them there. They're our buddies.
But, and I did it. Thank you. I did this, I think about 2 years ago now. It's called Defense Civil Society. And it talks about the people within Canada writ large who aren't actually involved in implementation. So, and I lump in Parliament as part of this, the parliamentary committees, and just look at just how underdeveloped we are. The people who, the office space, I'm the one who takes the requirements to the people in the middle there, right?
Yeah.
And there's just nobody there compared to, I'll give you a really good example, is that, so our parliamentary, the Office of Auditor General, Parliamentary Budget Office, those are sort of auditory bodies. Generally, you could classify them as, and there's probably less than 20 people involved in doing these kind of functions they're doing the analysis and all that. Whereas if you look at the Government Accountability Office in the United States, really nice discussion with them. There's like, they're about 450 to 500, just, looking at these issues at a one day. And you just look every day, how many journalists are there who are actually on defense beat? At the time, I think there was only 3. I think it's gone up a little bit more, but I mean, it's let's say it's less than 10, right? In the US,
and we'd know them all.
Oh, we all talk to each other. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's pretty narrow. But if you look at the United States, just the Defense Corps in Washington is like their official, or they're not official. The membership is it's over 100 at least. Like in some of these, and there's far more than that who aren't official in that sense, right? So the lack of understanding that exists within the highest political levels is not surprising. It's just there's just nobody who actually can talk about or think about these issues or can kind of interpret and navigate what is necessary for Canada. So that's I think that's a broader issue that we have. Now, if we think about, I guess one of the biggest questions that we have right now, looking at the various the commentariats or debate, and sort of also what's been released as, for lack of better platforms at this stage by the various political candidates, is, are we going to be a North American centric, or are we going to try to become multilateral with Europe? And as I argued recently, and I said it earlier, actually, is if you look at the ONSAP spending profiles, it's all going for North American stuff. And that was at the time, mostly from my view, is to placate American policymakers to say, hey, look, we're doing something. We're going to come close to 2% of the concerns that we're going to fit here the most are going to be your concerns, right? And we're going to
Arctic defense, NORAD modernization, new fighter jets. Yeah,
exactly. And all the stuff that got funded, that got money dollars put in that column beside it, that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Army, artillery, sorry guys. And the reality you mentioned earlier is like, we barely can keep that brigade in Latvia, right? And if it went to a war, it's not going to be pretty, because we don't have capacity, we don't have overmatch, we don't have any of those sort of things. We're just there, right? So given what's going on in the South, a lot of people have said, well, let's become a European power, right? All right, sure. The problem is that the capacity within Department of National Defense to do what I was talking about before, developing the process in order to, acquire the new systems and keep us, fighting at the cutting edge of fighting technology, there isn't anybody there. The years of these cutbacks, the people who are this rarefied subject matter expert who understands technology in a real intrinsically effective way that's taken decades to develop that expertise, that person doesn't exist. Or they do exist, but there's so few of them, and they're running around from program to program to program to kind of try to keep things running because there isn't anybody. That's just the reality of D&D. So the ability to quickly execute on these areas, it's not there. And it will take years, literally, if not a decade, to actually build up the people and the process and all that in order to allow us to execute on these programs. So that's kind of the bigger dynamic of, I think, where it is. Whether or not we want to go towards Europe and build up more capacity and build up a larger army, sure. But everything we can do on the actual cutting, the sort of the teeth side, the fighter jet, the tank, the troop, on the ground, or the frigate, for the most part, save for one exception, the capacity to build that up or to build new systems is not there. We can maybe expand the size of some of the capabilities. Like, we could buy more F-35s. That's actually an easier thing to do. But again, we don't have pilots. Our pilot training system is in transition. It's not going to come on fully online for another couple of years here. And that's going to take years for us to develop and push forward to expand that. So everywhere we look, it's a real challenge to build up the art. The only exception, and I've argued this, is basically the submarine program. The submarine program has staff attached to it. The Navy knows what it needs.
Yeah.
It can execute, whether or not they want to run a competition or they just want to go direct to one of the bidders. There's really only one who can fit it in a much quicker timeline. That's South Korea. Then you have the Germans, and you have the French further down the way. That's the only program that can realistically deliver capability fast. You can get some of the capabilities for the Army quicker because it's just, they're smaller. There's stuff, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like a big $2 billion submarine or whatever it is, right? It's it's an artillery piece that we pay $4 million for, right? And we just buy more. So it's easier to that, and that could help, but in general, it's really tough to ramp up. It's particularly, I should say, for the atrophy and lack of spending that's gone on. There's the training capacity doesn't exist. Part of the, we've actually rebuilt our entire training capacity just to support a mission in Latvia. We picked up huge pieces of it and moved it to Latvia because that was the only way the Army could maximize what it had in order to keep a brigade going in Latvia.
You know, when we talk about what kind of a military we're going to have, and you've raised the issue, the first decision we're going to have to make is, well, first of all, it's not really a choice whether or not we're going to be continental defense or we're going to be sort of more multilateral. The choice we have to make is how much, in addition to continental defense, we're going to want to be able to do. And that's actually the easy conversation to have. Like, we need to figure out, okay, on top of our domestic commitments, and especially to keep the Americans happy, do we want to be able to sustain a brigade in the field indefinitely? And if so, what do we want its capabilities to be? And then we have to go, we got to buy that stuff and we have to train the people to do that. Do we want to be able to base a fighter squadron or more in Europe or somewhere else? If so,
in the Arctic.
there you go. So yeah, I mean, we make that decision, then we buy the stuff, we train the people, and do we want to be able to deploy naval task groups well beyond North America to the Pacific and to Europe? Okay, if we do, well, we're going to need this number of ships, this kind of ships. We're going to need logistical support, so we're going to need supply ships, so we're going to need this many sailors. So we can have all those conversations. The more interesting conversation to me is, what are we going to have to do to be a credible defense partner in North America? And I know better than to bring too much Twitter into this, because you and I have been talking already about the completely broken information ecosystem that exists out there. But guys like you and me and others are arguing for a much larger Canadian Armed Forces and a much more capable Canadian Armed Forces for continental defense. And idiots are going like, what, you think we're going to win a war with America? It's not to defeat America in a war. It's so that America doesn't decide to simply start doing stuff on our territory because they have rightly concluded that we can't. So if there's some kind of emergency in the Arctic, we want to have the ability to be like, okay, we're on it, and be credible, as opposed to the Americans just giving us a ringy dingy and saying, hey, this is what's happening. Don't worry, we're taking care of it for you. Because if we get to that point, we might as well just be annexed.
I would say this, and I've made this argument for years, is that whatever you say, like, Donald Trump's going to be out of office in what? It's 3 years minus
3.8 years.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right? Like, and a lot of these ideas that people are proposing, it's that, the river class destroyer will not be in service by the time, Donald Trump's out of office. So stripping out the Aegis combat system that's built by Lockheed Martin and whoever is not, you're not going to affect that. And canceling the F-35 is not going to, that's not going to happen. But I'll put it this way, is that if we are in a broad-based negotiation with Trump, do you think it's more helpful or less helpful that we are seen to be a credible partner on our defense, right? And do you think it's going to make them happier or less happy that we're just going to say, no, screw you guys, we're not going to do this defense stuff? Of course not. You want to have you want to minimize the leverage the U.S. government or the Trump administration has on you on any sort of area. And right now we look pretty shabby, to the point that I said before, like, how many fighters can we put out there? What's the quality of the fighters, right? And where's our over the horizon radar and our network systems that tie into NORAD? Like, what's all those kind of capabilities? Because if you look at what the Trump administration cares about right now, it's clear, as it's being called Golden Dome, right? The defense of North America, from missiles and whatever. That is the one defense priority I can point to right now that has been consistent across every single channel. Is that we want to be better at, protecting the homeland from, whatever missiles.
And drones a little bit, missile drones, yeah.
Missiles, whatever, right? The whole gamut of threats, right? And if you think through that trend line, is that if we're just going to abrogate that and not care about that, they're going to come back at us and say this is unacceptable. And we're not going to have any allies across the U.S. political system. Right now, Canada needs political allies in Congress. Desperately so. And even they have been talking about better missile defense systems, in North America in order to defend this area. And so that is one area. And like, unfortunately, we sit beside the United States. And for whatever you want to say about the Trump administration, they are They are the government of the day right now. Now that will change.
Mhm.
They're going to have a lot, whatever, right? But to some degree, we need to address some of this. We cannot just, thumb our nose at them and say we're not going to do anything because it will get worse. This 25% tariffs are just, could be the start if we just ignore every single one of the concerns and watch what happens. That's, you know, to some of their credit. I think the Trudeau government has kind of started dealing with this area, but I think
Mhm.
it's so late and we've been so ineffective at addressing the concerns that across the US government for years have identified that now we're in this state, right? So that's to me is like you cannot ignore their concerns. We have to, in some degree, if you want to do Europe and you want to curry political capital within European governments, we have to do stuff for them too. Because when I saw Keir Starmer and stuff like what happened with the Trump administration there
Yep.
when his meeting, I mean, for over a decade, Europeans were asking us to do more, and we were dragged kicking and screaming in order to finally upsize the brigade. And it took a year. And so do you think that they number one, they're going to care about the national their own national interest
Yeah.
for start, but we didn't care about their interests very much for a good portion of time. So I don't think they feel that they have much loyalty to our government as this kind of helpful, party, especially when we're going to have to make our own deal with the United States as well. That may not include them, but we may throw them under the bus just as quickly as they threw us under the bus with Trump administration.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we've talked a little bit about strategic thinking and how little there is. So let's actually do some strategic thinking just right now.
Yeah.
If we want the Europeans to give a shit about what we think about anything, that is going to mean we're going to have something they want. And that could be natural resources. Like if the Europeans are going to go on a military modernization spree, yeah, they might need steel and aluminum. And I might have good news for them on that front because we might be looking for a new market for some of that stuff. So we can offer them things like that. But I think if we are reverting to a more pre-World War II international order, the only thing that's going to matter is hard power. And if we want to matter in Europe, they're going to have to actually see in Canada a brigade, some naval task forces, some fighter squadrons. They're going to have to care if we show up or not. And if we don't have anything to bring, they're not going to care. Like they don't need another flag on the stationery that they put the press
Got a lot
releases
of them.
on.
They've got a lot of them.
They
I
got an
mean,
awful lot.
but I mean, it's not even the hard part. Think about, I mean, when you had Olaf Scholz come to our country and it said, "Look, we want LNG. We want to make deals," and we have our politicians say, "Look,
Yeah.
there's no economic case for this, right? Like, well, part of this is they're this is what they wanted. Same Japan. Japan asked for the
Mhm.
exact same thing, and we didn't help them in these sort of ways. So yeah, we do have to show that we are serious about this, and that you're right. It does. The hard power side of it matters. So we've not been laggards so much in the Ukrainian spend.
Mhm.
I think we're about average. Yeah, being charitable, that but I mean, we're about average, and they see that. But I mean, it's gonna go up a lot.
Mhm.
And I think the next NATO meeting is gonna see a I know Trump's talking about 5%. That's probably not realistic, but
Euros are
3%.
talking about 3, 3.5,
Yeah,
and we're still
you are.
debating 2.
Oh, exactly. And I think I'll take the thing about Czechia. Like they put into law that they have to hit 2%. They have done so, and they are trying to lead in a way. And you think about thinking about the 1930s and 1940s, how Canada really led in the terms of productive capacity
Mhm.
for warfighting. Like we basically built the majority of the trucks that were used by the Commonwealth and allies in order to fight in Europe. And we have just dragged our heels on this, as we talked about before, about munitions production, about a whole bunch of other areas. And the reality is that we're still well placed for this. Like we still, because of the nature of the auto sector, our
Mhm.
aerospace, where I think we're fifth or sixth largest producer of aerospace capabilities, we can continue to play that. The real challenge, however, is that we don't invest in these areas, and we don't. In the past, a lot of these, there's been programs where the Europeans wanted to do joint production or wants to be a thing, and we spent it, and then we just pulled out of it.
Yeah.
And it just irks a lot of, like, I can think about a short range air-to-air missile, the IRST. We were partnered in, and we just pulled out in the mid 2000s, stuff like that.
Yeah, but we
So
saved millions of dollars by doing that.
precise. So and that's the thing. Like, money matters. That shows
Mhm.
real intent. And we've not, as I said before, we spent to continental defense. We've shortchanged the European or the expeditionary side. And until I think we actually start putting real money, we go and see, go to the EU countries and say, we want to join your armored vehicle project for this. We'll make sure we get contracts for GDLS or General Dynamic Land Systems or something, right? Like, if you can do that and ensure this, I think they'd be receptive for it. The problem is that Canada has just not has been unable to. And is in some ways, even when we wanted to your point about earlier about munition spending, we've been so sclerotic and
Mhm.
slow about moving on these opportunities that it's really to the detriment of just our foreign policy in general.
One of the real concerns I have, and I'm gonna have a specific question to put to you in a minute, but just a concern I have is a little bit of what I was talking about before, where the understanding of what the military is and what it's for is wrong. And there's decades of political consensus in Canada that the military, again, is to show up at NATO events and get invited to the parties. It's to go on a joint training exercise with the Americans so that we can then make friends and call in favors at Congress. And it's to support Canadian domestic industries. And I've said this before, our military procurement system, and you and I and guys like us, we lament it, but it's actually great. We just haven't called it the right thing. We think it's a terrible military procurement system because we've tricked ourselves into thinking its job is to procure things for the military. If we accurately labeled it the Federal Jobs Grant Distribution Program, it would be amazing. We would be celebrating its success at directing Canadian tax dollars to certain specific ridings where industries are. Um, and I'm worried that at a political level and at the bureaucratic level, that they don't think the right ways. And the hardest thing to do is change the way you think. So if we double defense spending, we're going to, I worry, end up with a military that is capable of 100% more symbolic posturing, not necessarily a military that's capable of having a battle group in Latvia that if God forbid, but if war comes and we're losing 100 soldiers a week, we're not going to need 9 months of training to send 100 guys. And that if we have a battalion of tanks, 20 or 30 tanks there, and two of them get blown up in the first day of battle, we're not going to be 11 years down queue in production of some new South Korean vehicle. We're actually going to have tanks in Canada. We go, whoop, okay. Well, we lost this number this week, so we're going to put them on a ro-ro ship and send them to France. Like, there are all these capabilities out there. And like I said, politically, what are like the liberals are going to be like, man, we're going to direct even more money to Canadian industries. And the conservatives are going to be like, well, we're going to do that and we're going to buy 20% more because we take defense seriously. I don't know if there's anyone in parliament right now or is likely to be in the next parliament who's actually going to have the kind of conversation you and I are having right now, which is what do we need the military to be able to do? And what is it going to need to be able to do those things? I just don't know if they think that way.
No, I think this is a situation that's been completely foreign to any Canadian politician. Yeah, I think Mulroney saw parts of it. He understood this.
Mhm.
Trudeau Senior did not. I mean, this is really you're probably going back to Diefenbaker
Sound wrong.
yeah, Saint Laurent and Pearson. That's where it is. And
Little.
like that goes back. Yeah, and I mean that's the Glasgow Commission and unification stuff like that. That's when that debate really came to the fore. It's not understood in that sort of way. And the problem is that at that time, sure, the technology environment was changing and there was different capabilities, but the political environment was stable as a
Mhm.
rock. I've mentioned this before is that, Canada's contribution to NATO was proscribed pretty heavily to the point where we were looking at if we wanted to have submarines, as we did in the late 1950s and early 60s, we had to go to NATO and get our changes pre-approved because it was part of a NATO doctrine and forces list that said what everybody had to do, and that doesn't exist. Because right now, as we're saying, we have real geopolitical dysfunction. Is it going to be China, in South China Sea, or is it going to be Russia and in Latvia or whatever? It's not clear, and so there isn't as a proscribed list of what does Canada have to do, right?
Mhm.
In some ways, Canada's in a bad position. I mean, if we want to be if we just wanted to just join the Americans and hide in North America, okay, sure. But we're not going to do that, right? We see that there's real value in this international order that currently exists, right? So that means we have to spend for the contingencies in Europe, right? We also have to spend for contingencies in the South China Sea. We have to defend, our allies, the Japanese and the South Koreans, and Taiwan and others, and other, the Philippines and Vietnam. So that means we need other capabilities there. So that understanding, to we've basically I've derided this kind of tokenism.
Mhm.
That, but
Exactly what it is.
we've kind of said, "Oh, we'll have our capabilities here." As you were saying, we're going to fly our flags and we're going to be there. But the reality is that that doesn't integrate to any sort of real war plan, like a
Yep.
real one. It's like, what is this war going to look like if the Chinese Communist Party surrounds Taiwan, like,
Yep.
and sets up blockade? What does that entail? Who's going to fight this? Who are we there with? We just kind of said, "Oh, thus far, our planning has looked at, well, we're just going to be on an American battlefield, and
Mhm.
that's it.
Well, we'll
That's it.
chip in an extra escort. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll have a submarine that can go to Yokosuka or somewhere else, right, and be able to operate there. But that's it. That's all we're going to do, right? And I don't really think that we've thought through, if or again, since the end of World War II, like, what does a war look like? How we're going to play into this in a real substantial way, and what's necessary, and how can we, clear we're not going to be fighting this alone. Clearly not, right? But how can we make a meaningful a contribution to this struggle? Because it reminds me a lot of how King looked at the 1930s. And then when he actually had to fight the war, then you saw the massive blossoming of the armed force and the spending there. But they were significantly behind the times as the war started. We were just unable to provide any contribution until, let's like, significantly so. We provided pilots, sure, and personnel, but we really weren't hitting our stride. So about 42, 43.
Mhm.
And that is that lag. And if we look at how a war that would happen in South China Sea, or a greater conflict in Russia, it's not, we won't have that time.
No.
Right now is that time to actually invest that. And even now we're delaying. And that's the real problem, is that the modernization, not just of the military, but the enablers, the industries and whatnot, takes decades in some ways. And we haven't even started.
No.
But we just made like little incremental additions to it.
What do you want? And this will be my second last question for you here. What do you want the Canadian military to be able to do in North America by 2035? What do you think we need to be able to actually do on our own? Because we were talking a little bit a minute ago about, putting your chips in terms of hard to power. One of the other things we're going to need to make sure to do is that we reduce the amount of leverage any White House, Trump or otherwise, because all the big picture stuff we've been talking about, what the Americans are doing, I don't think that goes away under the next Democratic president. I think they'll do it with a smile on their face, and they'll say nicer things. But I think the foreign policy of the direction of the United States has been set for a while, at least for our foreseeable future. Um, One of the things that right now we're vulnerable to is the Americans threatening to turn off support because we don't have those capabilities. So we have a strategic interest as a country of, and I'm not saying we go out and build Minuteman missiles, but we need to be able to become more capable of looking after ourselves so that the Americans have less leverage to use on us. What do we as a country, or what should we as a country be working toward being able to do in Canada, in North America, in the next 10 years?
I I mean, so if we think about the North American, continent and defense issues, the last white paper, as I said before, is what Canada's going to do, right? Over the horizon radar, new fighters, building out the networks that allow us to, to operate interoperate interchangeably with the United States, as the term is, right? And I think that's the best. There's not much deviance. The only area that you can actually see again to to make any more greater contribution is submarines, and that's part of the reason why it was part of ONSAF, right? One of the big issues I think that's coming down is that, as saying, the Golden Dome approach is identifying some really exquisite, highly technically well, I would say infeasible, but it's basically on the cusp of actually being able to be deployed. Stuff like Brilliant Pebbles, which is space-based anti-ballistic missile systems,
Yep.
right? I think that that is clearly politically a bridge too far for Canadians, right? Any depart, because it's seen as being a Trump administration idea. It's not really feasible, so it's not going to happen. So I think the approach to saying that, I think the approach that we need to take is that what can we provide that is as a negotiating chip? Because in some ways, there's a bit of leverage there for Canada. There
Mhm.
actually is. If you like, because we occupy what 80% of the frontage towards the north for the United States, we have to be a part of some sort of response, right? And so we can use that in some ways as a bit of reverse leverage.
Mhm.
And if we say, look, we are willing to work with a lot of your systems, where we may chip in a bit for their space-based kind of sensor systems,
Yep. We're going to operate
not
some of those sites
yeah,
for you. We're going to make sure you get
yeah,
good real-time data. Yep.
exactly. We're willing to put this area because it's in our own interest as well, right? I think that actually helps Canada to some
Mhm.
degree, and it allows us to show, hey, you know, we're here for the stuff. We disagree with you on, let's say, the space-based weapon system, but this is the stuff we're willing to do. Uh, don't this isn't an issue, right? And I think that that gives a bit of a win to the Trump administration because you
Yeah.
cannot. I mean, you want to avoid every piece of leverage, every excuse he's got to give us another 10% or
I know.
5% on that, right? And this is an area that everybody, not just like the Trump administration, it's Congress, even the Europeans are saying we aren't spending enough. So we got to be strong in our own house in some ways and ensure that we have these systems are paid for and sort of do it. And that realistically requires us to cooperate with the United States. And again, Trump is going to leave in 4 years, right? Then, as you say, the next administration is going to say the exact same thing. They're going to say, "Look, these are threats. We need you to spend on it." The reason why we didn't sign on SAF in the Trump administration period, we did it during the Biden administration,
Mhm.
and so we just got to follow through on those kind of on the items that are identified in that document.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on the leverage point, right? Like we show up and we say, hey, look, we've got a check here for $30 billion that we're going to put into northern infrastructure, and you're going to tell us what you need, and we're going to get it for you. But come on, knock off these tariffs. Like it gives us something that we actually can show up with. And right now, we've been yelling at Wayne Gretzky and talking about, we stormed the beaches of Normandy together. Like we just psychologically, honestly, maybe something Jen and I have talked about, Richard, is that I get the feeling in the last week or two, some mental switches have finally been popping. But I'm looking at half the Canadian and European intelligentsia getting to where I was the morning after the election.
No, and I
And,
think I think they've gone further than that. I think in some ways they've over like gone beyond this analysis. Now they're saying it's like, oh, it's like America is this imperialist power that's going to take over, and it's like, no, like I'm no fan of this administration. Like, just the issue. It's really caused like the underlying order that we have prospered under is at risk, clearly so. But at the same time, what they're doing, we still have to deal with them. And what they're doing, we can us collectively as the West, like Canada and Europe and some of the Asian allies, need to work together as well to provide some of that security because the US doesn't want to provide it in Eastern Europe. That's clear. But we still have to cooperate with them. They are the largest arm producing country in the world, right? We still use their systems.
Mhm.
And I don't see the risk of being annexed at all, but we still have to work with them to secure. We just like France is sitting beside Germany in 1939. They can't move themselves away. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to make a comparison between Germany in 1939 and in the United States, except to say that there's the geopolitical reality and a huge segment of the US populace thinks warmly of Canada, do not think that the majority, I would assume, sees that, doesn't want to annex us and all that. This is just, some talk that's coming out of the White House that's seriously has, hit a nerve, right? But the reality is that we still have to provide a common defense. That's just that it's in our interest. If we take the values aside and all that, it is still in both of our interests to do so, and that will guide. And it's clear, and they've said it's in their very stated that they want to provide that defense. So we have to work together on that one area. Now, whether or not they're going to provide for European or Asian security, that's a different question. That's a question that we really need to deal with. But the geopolitical reality is that we are beside them and we have the same interest for that defense. And working on that common issue benefits our both and may well allow us to avoid some other areas of discomfort between our bilateral economic relations.
Well, I told you a minute ago I had two more questions for you, but you just answered the second one. So I've got
I took 2 minutes doing it. So reality,
No.
it just kind of came out equal in the end.
Hey, man, it's a long form podcast. I didn't bring you on for sound bites. This is a chance where we actually get to explore the space a little bit and talk out some of these issues. Well, look, it's been a pleasure to have you on. You and I have talked about these issues for years. We'll bring you back on in a couple of months. We'll do a bit of an update. We'll take the pulse of where we stand on things. But in the meantime, I really appreciate you joining me, man. Thanks so much for this. Take care. And whenever I talk about these issues, I make a point of ending with God help us all. So God bless. Good to get you on, man. Really appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Adam.
Right. That was my conversation with Richard Shimooka of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and you can read him at the Hub and elsewhere. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, check us out at our main page, readtheline.ca. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, leave us a glowing review. Always, though, stay tuned for the next episode, which will come out on Tuesday. This has been On the Line.